Western world, the Western
world,
press.
primarily in the United States, but in the West altogether. And it directly followed these expressions of opinion, which are very likely those of maybe a majority of Afghans, and maybe even more. In fact, he went even further. He said that he would invite Mullah Omar, the head of the Taliban, to Afghanistan to try to work out a solution. And he added, the United States isn't going to like this, but they have two choices. They can either accept it or they can throw me out. And in fact, that's what they're doing. There are now plans to replace President Karzai, to sort of push him upstairs and leave him in it's assumed that he'll win the next election, so put him in a symbolic position and impose basically U.S.-appointed surrogate who will essentially run the country, because that can't be tolerated. In any event, there are alternative proposals. They're discussed here. They're widely discussed in Afghanistan at the highest level and apparently among the population, to just move towards a peaceful settlement among Afghans and a regional settlement which would take into consideration the concerns of the neighboring powers.
Why do you think Obama is expanding this war, and do you call it Obama's war now?
Well, this goes way back. I mean, the United States has sort of a comparative advantage in world affairs, namely military might, not economic power, not treasury reserves. I mean, it's a very powerful state, but it's one of several. It's comparable to Europe. It's comparable to rising East Asia in, say, economic power. But in military power, it is supreme. The United States spends approximately as much as the rest of the world in military force. It's far more technologically advanced. And when you have a comparative advantage, you tend to use it. So policy decisions tend to drift towards where you're strong. And where you're strong is military force. It's the old joke. If you have a hammer, everything you see is a nail. And I think that's a very much of a driving force. And there's also a long-standing imperial mentality, which says we have to control and dominate. And in particular, we have to dominate energy resources. Now, that goes way back. After the Second World War, it's been maybe the prime factor in U.S.
And the energy resources in Afghanistan?
No, they're not in Afghanistan. They're in mostly in the Gulf, secondarily in Central Asia, but Afghanistan is right in the middle of this system. I mean, there is a pipeline question. How powerful it is, you can speculate, but there have been long-standing plans for a pipeline from Turkmenistan in Central Asia to India, which would get the TAPI, it's called, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India. Now, that's of significance to the United States for a number of reasons. For one thing, if it would run right through Afghanistan and through Kandahar province, one of the most conflicted areas. If it was established, it would, for one thing, reduce the reliance of the Central Asian states on Russia, so it would weaken their role. But more significant, it would bypass Iran. I mean, India needs energy, and the natural source is Iran. And in fact, they're discussing an Iran to India pipeline. But if you could get natural gas flowing from Central Asia to India, avoiding Iran, that would support the U.S. policy, which is now very clear. In Obama's case, it's been made more concrete, of forming an alliance of regional states to oppose Iran. In fact, that's John Kerry, the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, recently made an important speech about that with regard to Israel-Palestine. He said we have to reconceptualize the issue. So it's not an Israel-Palestine problem, but rather we'll sort of put that to the side. And what we have to do is create an alliance of Israel and what are called the moderate Arab states. And moderate is a technical term, means they do what we say. And so the moderate Arab states include the brutal Egyptian dictatorship, the radical fundamentalist dictatorship in Saudi Arabia, and so on. They're the moderates. And they have to join with Israel and us in an anti-Iranian alliance. And we have to, of course, break ongoing connections between Iran and India to the extent that we can, and elsewhere. And that puts the Israel-Palestine problem issue to the side.
I want to get to Israel-Palestine, but we have to break. And before we do, just a quick question. Do you think Obama should pull the troops out of Afghanistan immediately?
Well, you know, I think the Afghans should make that decision.
How?
They have ways. For example, what the peace movement calls for is their traditional way of making decisions, a Loya Jirga, major meeting of elders, other figures, and so on, who will try to arrive at consensus on this with all the Afghans. And it should be their decision. I mean, we have no right to be there.
We're talking to Noam Chomsky, Professor Emeritus at MIT, author of more than 100 books on U.S. foreign and domestic policy. We'll be back with him in a minute.